busy bees, and welcome to the Hive Live. I'm your host, Stacey Diggs, owner of Hive Minds Marketing, and today we're going to continue our conversation with Arkansas State University's Executive Director, Adam Long, and Buddy Bradbury, docent at the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum. Hi, guys.
Hey,
Good
how are you?
afternoon.
I'm doing good. So we left off last time talking about the Pfeiffer family and who they were and why they were important to Piggott, because I think a lot of times Hemingway gets the big spotlight, and understandably so, because he was a very big presence on the global scene. Everybody has heard of Ernest Hemingway, but a lot of people were not as familiar with the Pfeiffer family. So I feel like that was a really good conversation we had in regards of who they were and why they were relevant beyond just the connection to Hemingway. But today we are going to start talking about Hemingway and how he comes into the scene. So, would one of you guys like to just kind of tell me, how did Hemingway and the Pfeiffer family come to connect with each other?
Sure. So when the Pfeiffer family moved to Piggott in 1913, their oldest daughter, Pauline, was had just graduated from high school from the Academy of the Visitation in St. Louis, and she went to the University of Missouri and studied journalism, and then after graduating there, had a very promising career in journalism. She worked on the East Coast for a while, and then by 1925 had moved to Paris and was working for the editor of Vogue in Paris. And at the same time, Ernest Hemingway was living in Paris. He had been with the Red Cross in World War I, where he'd been injured, and then following that, he'd worked in Toronto for a while, and had then ended up in Paris, and was trying to, was doing some foreign correspondent work, but was trying to, make a living as a writer there. So they were both in Paris, and they were running in pretty different circles, but they did have a mutual friend, a woman named Kitty Cannell, who invited them to the same party. And actually, Ernest was married at the time to his first wife, Hadley Richardson. They had one son, Jack, who as a kid went by the nickname Bumby. So Hadley and Pauline at that party became good friends. And Hadley and Pauline, yeah.
So his current wife and Pauline became friends.
Yes.
First.
Yes.
Oh, ooh, the intrigue.
Yes, and so then Hadley started inviting Pauline around more, and eventually Pauline and Ernest started an affair, and then in 1927, Ernest left Hadley and married Pauline.
Oh my goodness. Well, Hemingway was quite a controversial character when he wanted to be.
He was.
Which was often. Okay, so Pauline and Hemingway, they form a relationship. Did they get married right away, or was it like a courtship of sorts?
So they pretty much got married as soon as the divorce was final. So we think that the affair probably started around Christmas 1925. Hadley and Ernest took a ski trip to Schruns, Austria, and Pauline accompanied them. And it was roughly in that time that the affair started. And then they were married on May the 10th of 1927. When Ernest let Hadley know about the affair, Hadley, before she would consent to an annulment of the marriage, she insisted that Ernest and Pauline be separated for 100 days to make sure it wasn't just momentary passion. And so Pauline came back to Piggott during that time, and a number of letters are exchanged back and forth, and Ernest is working on a collection of short stories called Men Without Women during that time, and basically he just keeps begging Hadley to let him have the divorce, and finally she gives in before the 100 days are over, and then they're married pretty much right away after that.
So did Ernest come to Piggott to join Pauline at this point, or did she go to Hemingway?
She returned to Paris, and they were married in Paris.
Okay. Okay. So, also interesting to note, Paris during this point in time is really hopping as far as artists and really interesting, like vibrant cultural scene going on. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You've got such people as Ford Madox Ford, Sherwood Anderson, Ezra Pound, Scott Fitzgerald, who had just published Tender as the Night, and John Dos Passos. Ernest is struggling to publish and publishes in literary magazines. Uncle Gus, Paul's youngest brother, sees the potential in Ernest Hemingway and is encouraging him and promoting, which is what Uncle Gus does best. And he can vision the marriage between a journalist that's an editor and a writer that is aspiring to become something new and different. It is to the Stein galleries that Ernest is going on a very regular basis, so much so that sometimes he has to be asked to leave the gallery so that they can close. It is the Stein family who had come from New York and established on the West Bank a gallery representing the impressionistic painters of the time. It was Cézanne that Ernest had been so captivated by. The portraits of Madame Cézanne told absolutely different stories. The brushstrokes, the hue, the tone, the texture, the expression on the face, the background, all of it. Each portrait was distinctively different than the other. I like to sort of compare it to Van Gogh as he is slipping into insanity. You see this incredibly handsome young ginger-haired man with blue eyes who, in his insanity, becomes old and very tired and physically very different than he was. And so it is Gertrude Stein that says to Ernest, if this is what captivates you, then you need to find some way to represent this in your writing. And so we get the iceberg theory, where Ernest only gives the reader 20% of the story, forcing the reader to be an integral part of the literary process. Rather new concept, because the writers loved their flowery language and their long descriptions. Ernest is forcing the reader to be a part of that literary process, and not very popular at first, I guess, and then that changes over time.
Yeah. So that was a very different style that he had at that time that he became famous for later on, but it wasn't particularly well received at the time. Maybe some criticism for that at that time period.
But that style would later become the dominant form of writing in the United States. It became the American style of writing later in the 20th century.
And when in the affair, Ernest gets Pauline pregnant and she has an abortion, he writes for Dos Passos and Fitzgerald at the bar that they go to every night. They challenge him to write an entire story in only 6 words. And on the paper he writes, for sale, baby shoes, never used.
Ooh, wow. That's some stuff right there. I wonder, Hills Like White Elephants, I believe it's a short story. Is that also like during this time period of Pauline's abortion?
Yes, so it is. It was written after the fact from that, and that's one of the main the main pieces of evidence for that being true. Of course, they didn't really talk about that at the time,
Sure.
but there are oblique references and letters and such. And then the story Hills Like White Elephants, which seems to be biographical. So I would say that a majority of biographers probably agree with that now, but there's not,
Not a
the
direct
level of
connection.
medical records or the kind of thing you would, given the circumstances.
And then Ernest makes the statement that he would have named the baby that was aborted Pilar because it was a little girl fetus. And that was the name that he uses for Pauline in his clandestine relationship with her while he's married to Hadley.
Oh, wow.
And the name of his boat. Guys in their sports, and they equate that to, so.
And also one of the main characters in For Whom the Bell Tolls.
For Whom the
Pilar,
Bell Tolls.
Yeah, he did like to insert himself into his work in indirect ways, but I'm thinking about, I just recently read The Sun Also Rises, and it's set during the running of the bulls, and it's this large group of characters, the main character of which I have read since, we can assume Hemingway based on himself, but it was based on a probably an experience that actually did happen of him going to Spain. And it's a bunch of debauchery, everyone going and just partying for days and days and days upon end. and just how that haggards the relationships over a period of time.
Yeah, it was close enough to reality that his friends that in real life went to Pamplona with him. Some of them got angry with him for the way they were depicted in the book, even though the names were changed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can see that. So, all right. So Pauline goes back to this amazing Paris scene with Hemingway, who I am assuming at this point he's starting to become more known for his writing.
Yeah, so the Sun Also Rises, which is his first major novel. He'd had some success with short stories and had written some other things, but his first Sun Also Rises was his first major novel, and it was published in 1925, shortly after he met Pauline. Pauline did read a final draft of it before it was after it was sent to printer. She didn't really have. She wasn't editing for him at this point or anything, but she did. It came right when their relationship started, and then in 1928 is when he 28 and 29 is when A Farewell to Arms comes out, which becomes his first big hit, and then movie rights to that are optioned, and that's where I would say, becomes really a famous author.
And that one was written partially here in Piggott, correct?
Correct. Yes.
It was.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are alternative endings. All of the Pfeiffer family are overachievers, and when Max Perkins tells them he's not quite sure whether they can publish it because of the subject matter being a little risque for Scribners to publish, instead of just writing one alternative ending, he wrote 41, am I right? 40-something,
Yeah,
41 alternative endings, and those are now published at the end of the book.
No kidding.
Although the original ending is the one that will always be used in the movie and in the book.
That's very interesting. So for people that maybe haven't visited the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum, Hemingway had a writing nook or writing studio. What would you call it?
So the family eventually would convert the loft of the barn behind their house into a writing studio for Ernest. But they actually did that after A Farewell to Arms was successful. Ernest was already going up to the barn loft when it was basically just a storage room because it had a nice breeze in the summer and it was private. And so he would write there, but he would sometimes write on the front porch or other places around town. And then it was after A Farewell to Arms was successful that they decided to kind of renovate that as a studio space for him.
Okay, yeah. So Farewell to Arms was written partially in Piggott, and then I heard recently that when the movie came out, it premiered in two places, one of them being New York, and the other one being Piggott, Arkansas. I mean, that's pretty big big britches for Piggott, right?
It is, and they wanted them to be the Piggott premiere to be first, because Ernest was here in Piggott, and they wanted to the night before the New York premiere to show it, have Ernest see it, and then have quotes from Ernest for the media the next day for the New York premiere. But Ernest had heard that they had significantly changed the ending to the movie, and he was upset about that, so he refused to do that. So they went on with the premiere in New York, and then a couple days later, they did the premiere here in Piggott. Ernest didn't go, but the family did.
Okay, so that was at the Old Franklin
Yes.
Theater, right? Yes, it was actually, I was speaking about that with Chip O'Connor, who now is the current owner of what was the Franklin Theater, now is the Old Franklin Theater, Flea Market, and Antiques Mall. And also very knowledgeable man of Piggott history. He was telling me that Hemingway used to walk around Piggott, and I guess, of course, Hemingway is very well known for his drinking. Like he could drink hard, he could drink with the best of them. But I guess in that state, sometimes he'd let himself get a little ramshackled looking, and apparently Piggott kids would mistake him for a tramp. Because we're a railroad town here, and sometimes you would have tramps coming off of or so-called tramps, people riding the rails, hop off and take your pie off the windowsill or whatever. And so anyway, Chip told me that occasionally kids would mistake him for a tramp and throw rocks at him.
And right next door to the Franklin Theater was Smitty's livery stable and leather shop. Mm-hmm. And if you left the front of the building and walk around to the alley and came in the back door, Smitty had a moonshine still in the back. And that's one of the first things that Ernest discovers about Piggott.
Oh, I bet he did. So what did he think about Piggott? Because, I mean, Hemingway is a man of the world. Had they lived in Florida already at this point? Or, did they live in Florida? They just traveled to Florida a lot? Or
So they had begun visiting Key West on John Dos Passos' advice. And then Uncle Gus would buy them a home during this period in Florida. Mm-hmm. So while they were visiting, during his marriage with Pauline, and while he was a regular visitor here during Piggott, their permanent address was in Key West. So that was simultaneous.
Okay. So how did he feel about Piggott?
So Ernest, I think, enjoyed Piggott. At least the first time he visited, it was during a heat wave, and he made it pretty clear that he didn't enjoy that because it was before air conditioning.
Sure.
And everything.
Nobody enjoys that here.
Yeah. but then later he mentioned Piggott as one of his favorite places. Piggott in the fall during quail season. Ernest, though he lived in a lot of places and could was at home in cities all around the world and such, he did like being places where he can hunt and fish and being out in the country. So I think he liked it in Piggott. I don't think Pauline ever took to Piggott. She preferred cities.
Yes, yeah, she was very socialite.
Yeah. And fashion writer and
all of those things.
It's probably one of the reasons Uncle Gus gave her the endowment when she graduated from Visitation Academy, so that she could be independent. I mean, Dad is bringing the family from St. Louis, Missouri, one of the largest metropolitan areas in this part of the country.
The fourth biggest at the time, biggest in the country.
To Piggott, a town of 1,300 people, no sewers, no electricity, no running water, no paved roads, living on a gravel hill surrounded by swamps.
And I feel like we didn't get to really touch on Pauline's sister, and I also think she's such a very interesting character because she also was somebody that was in Piggott that didn't quite, fit in with the scene of Piggott, whatever you could call that scene back then. But I love how authentically herself she is. Could we talk a little more about who she was?
Pauline was the oldest, Carl was the second, Virginia was the third child. There will be a fourth, Max, who died at the age of 12 from the Spanish pandemic flu in 1918. So she's the third in the family. Younger than Pauline, grew up a little bit more in Piggott than Pauline did. But as her brother becomes involved with Gus, Uncle Gus Pfeiffer, and his companies in New Jersey and expanding to California, Southeast Asia, and South America, Carl becomes a sales rep for Uncle Gus after attending Notre Dame and Harvard, and expands the company sort of. He sells the cosmetics to the movie studios. When you've got stars wearing your cosmetics on the big screen and off the big screen, it becomes your advertising campaign. The reason that Charles Revson lusted after the company and acquired it in 1961, changed the name to Revlon Corporation. But it is Virginia who, seeing an opportunity in Carl being in California and people in California having a different mindset. They have family in California. The Warners, I believe, were in California at the time. The one that Pauline, the second cousin, she was supposed to be engaged to with the family, and she didn't want any part of it. But they've got family out there, and so it's Virginia that goes out to California. Mary had always, her mother had always insisted that they needed to find a way to give back to the world, that they were wealthy, but they needed to find some way to give back. Virginia takes a job as a film editor with RKO Studios. It is during her time there that she meets and falls in love with a 17-year-old Laura Archera, a violinist that had arrived from Italy and played at Carnegie Hall to rave reviews. She was absolutely gorgeous, petite, tiny, like Pauline, and the two become a couple. They leave RKO Studios and form a company which had not existed before, a production company, doing screen tests for the movie studios. That way people have to recognize you when you're doing something that the men are not doing. They have to recognize you because you are standing out in the crowd. And Virginia was tall. She was 6 feet tall, very beautiful, willowy, very charismatic, very magnanimous personality. Everybody absolutely loved being in her presence. And it is during their relationship that Laura, as told in this timeless moment, a biography that Laura will write, Laura falls in love with a man and brings him into the relationship with herself and with Virginia. She marries Aldous Huxley.
No kidding. Aldous Huxley.
Aldous, Brave New World.
Brave New
Brave New
World.
World.
And Doors of Perception, too, right? Mm-hmm. I had no idea that connection. Look at all the literary connection within the Pfeiffer family. That's wild. So they're in California at this point in time. So, probably a little more like, welcoming and to their lifestyle choices, I guess, even back then.
Lifestyle choices, interesting that you should say that, because it was Laura and Aldous especially, and I'm not sure how involved Virginia was, but Laura and Aldous will seek spirituality through Timothy Leary
And psychedelics.
and psychedelics.
Wow.
And so it's in this time period that everything is changing in the world, the dawn of a new age. And it is during this time in 1963 that Aldous Huxley will pass away. Virginia and Laura lived in a house at 6522 Mulholland Drive overlooking the Hollywood sign at that time. And it is those two ladies that feel that they have an empty nest and that there are things that they can do, things that go beyond selfish reasons. So it is Virginia who hires, I suppose, Uncle George Washington Pfeiffer, who was a lawyer, to go to the courts for her to see if she could adopt. She could not conceive on her own. Pauline had conceived and was not really a mother to the children as much as Virginia and Mary were the mothers that will raise the boys and be the loving and affectionate women that will impact their lives tremendously. So it is those two that carry the case all the way to the California Supreme Court. Hollywoodland newspaper, published by the community to which these ladies belonged on Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills, still publish articles regularly touting the courage of the two women. They will win the right, or Virginia will, to adopt as an openly gay individual and adopt two children, a son and a daughter, making the fellow afterwards, and still being debated and fought back and forth in California to this very day.
Right. Yeah. And so Pauline, bringing it back to Piggott, I mean, she was here in this, it's very insulated environment. Women wearing dresses and things like that was the norm. And even when Virginia, excuse me, she was wearing pants and like pantsuits, very stylish and elegant, but owning her own style and individuality.
She and Pauline both, as I understand, were very much high fashion. Pauline had been Vogue personified. She was among the first women to be in the higher echelon of Vogue and Vanity Fair. And they will continue to be fashion icons throughout their lives. It plays a big role in Gregory's life, actually, later on. So the youngest of the children.
I think that it's a really interesting part of Piggott history that I know we're segueing off of Hemingway again, right? But the Pfeiffer family, they brought so much to this area, and I think one of the things that is interesting to note and to look at is how they brought this new ideas and progressive things to an area that we're still experiencing and having conversations about today. It's still relevant to today. And I think we're just about out of time for this session, but I really enjoyed our conversation, guys. Thanks for coming in again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks for listening. That was the Hive Live, and join us next time.